Alright, making a video. So, I mean, if the video blinks off abruptly and then blinks back on, it's just me collecting my thoughts. I go to school all day. I'm usually kind of mentally exhausted by the time I get to making one of these videos, so it's just the way it is. It's the way it has to be. So, what I really want to talk about for this video is diamonds and the way they're produced and the implications of people buying diamonds and all this other good stuff. So just to be clear right out of the gate, I have a very hostile disposition towards diamonds and the way they're produced and pretty much their entire history. I mean, we've been producing commercially, the West has been commercially producing diamonds for over 125 years. And I mean, they're the disgusting nature of their production, that exists today is really pretty on par with the way they've always been produced. They actually have a lot of historical similarities with sugar in that there really, and cane sugar, that is, there really is no point in history when the vast majority or entirety of their production has not been performed by some type of slave, some type of person that has had the majority of their freedom and dignity and ability to economically sustain themselves forcibly deprived from them and manipulated either by gunpoint or by economic circumstance into producing cheap resources for the West. Right. The place where diamonds tend to deviate from something like sugar, for instance, is the issue of absolute literal slavery. So I mean, sugar plantations where people are literally enslaved at gunpoint, for instance. I mean, the vast majority of that went the way of the dinosaur with emancipation for the most part. But with the production of diamonds, it's still very much a fact of life for the industry, particularly in some of the more unstable areas of Africa. So I mean, the typical norm for sugar production, for instance, is this starving, emaciated, horribly desperate person living in a completely decimated economy, working one of these disgusting sugar plantation jobs for slave wages, and barely being able to feed themselves. But technically having the choice to leave their job and look for other employment someplace else. Not that anything like that exists, which means that they don't really have that freedom. But nobody's shoving a gun in their face for the for the man. Not that I know of, anyway. No, not that I've ever heard of any modern example of that as far as sugar. But with diamonds, that sort of thing does occur quite often, particularly in eastern and central Africa, places like the Eastern Congo, places like Uganda, Burundi, the Great Lakes region. So anyway, so with diamonds, you actually get the reverse of what we could talk about with sugar, where best case scenario, barring maybe a diamond that you get from Canada or some sort of quote unquote synthetic diamond that was produced in an artificially pressurized chamber, which make up a pretty small sub-minority of the total diamonds that's on the global market. Best case scenario, your diamond is being clawed out of the earth by some, again, starving, emaciated, terribly desperate worker working in horribly unsafe conditions, surrounded by an economy of scarcity that has been deliberately destroyed by Western action through by proxy of these extranational institutions like the IMF and the WTO and the World Bank. Best case scenario, that's what's happening with your diamond. Worst case scenario is that this rock was clawed out of the earth by someone that was forcibly told to go into a diamond mine at gunpoint, and is being used to fund, or has been used to fund the actions of some monstrous genocidal group of political dissidents that terrorize their own people. And now, whenever you get into conversations like this, or you go on a rant like this or something with people that own diamonds, or think it's okay to buy a diamond, or would like to have a diamond at some point in their life, you usually get this sort of who me reaction. This what are you saying? I'm a bad person sort of reaction. And I mean, really, what that comes down to is what you define as a good person, what you're even really describing when you say you're a good person. I mean, for most of us, being a good person, being good, is just sort of this formulaic, um, you know, uh, ill-conceived label that we just arbitrarily slap on ourselves, so that we don't have to spend too much of our time preoccupied with the moral implications of what we do, and so we can just proceed with the assumption that everything we do is good because we're good, and so how could it be any other way, right? I mean, remember in the last video I talked about this distinction between what we define as good and moral in terms of our personal life, and what we define as rational and logical and appropriate in an economic sense, and how you can have these monstrous habits in terms of the latter, while still considering yourself to be a moral, decent person in terms of the former. And I mean, the consumption of commodities like diamonds, for a lot of reasons, it really does feed in to this sort of dichotomy. Really, I mean, if you have any homogeny in your mind between these two types of acting, in terms of what you define as moral, and you still think it's okay to buy diamonds and own diamonds and produce diamonds and sell diamonds, then no. I mean, really, you're not a good person. There's no real logical way to justify that. You can't have it both ways. You just simply can't have it both ways. You don't get to prosper, and or entertain yourself off the products of other people's suffering and starvation and desperation and death and sickness and poverty, and still get to call yourself a good person, not in any way that's logically or ethically defensible. Anyway, and by the way, I include myself in this paradigm too. Like, I'm not giving myself some special dispensation just because I happen to be making a video about this sort of thing. I'm making a video on a computer that was made in through sweatshop labor in another country. That's part of this IMF structural readjustment, economic suppression sort of paradigm, right? I'm wearing clothes that's part of this same third world industrial construct. So I don't exclude myself from this. But something like diamonds, I identify as being relatively distinct from these other resources that, at a basic level, we need. I mean, for better or for worse, the average individual in a Western industrialized society needs to function at a basic level, to function and navigate the channels of power that exist to afford people a dignified life through successful navigation. So, education, business, government, so on and so forth. So a computer is one of these items. There really are. There's no American-made computers that I'm aware of, and American-made clothes are rare and often prohibitively expensive. Right? I mean, that's not an excuse. It's just a reason. The reason I draw some sort of distinction between diamonds and these other more utilitarian resources is just because of the extraneous absurdity of something like jewelry, something like this giant hunk of carbon, this object that is chemically no different than a piece of coal. It's just arranged differently, exposed to extreme pressures that places the carbon atoms in a nice, neat, packed formation and turns them into one gigantic molecule. It's extremely hard and strong and brittle, and blah blah blah, right? Um, I mean, we can talk all day about people making sneakers for 25 cents a day, and what shoes are more moral than other shoes, and which shoes have the least, the least impact in terms of this whole unethical neo-colonial construct that produces most of our material culture. But at the end of the day, we all have to wear shoes. We all have to find some shoes somewhere that we can feasibly afford. We do not have to wear jewelry. We do not have to give people gifts that do absolutely nothing other than promote our own self-aggrandizement and demonstrate our economic ability to project this ridiculous sense of self-importance and self-grandeur and false accomplishment to other people in our society, which is really what diamonds represent. They're just this vehicle for wallowing in the illusion of status and self-importance. I mean, most people that own diamonds, and I mean, mainly because of a set of marketing campaigns that the De Beers corporations began engaging in the 30s, but most of the people that own diamonds are not filthy rich. They're not these captains of industry that are influencing nations and driving economies and making these giant decisions that influence millions and millions of people. But the fact that they can own a diamond allows them to absorb some of the importance that centers around owning a diamond, and that partially associates them with that whole disposition of importance and prestige that's typically only tied up with that top elitist echelon of society that would fall under the description that most of us do not. I mean, we could talk all day about, in an anthropological sense, we could talk all day about the development of ritual and the necessity of of gift giving and the symbolism of achieving a sense of otherwise unavailable prestige through the reception of certain physical objects, blah 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 blah. What it really comes down to, this fascination with minerals and these supposedly, most of the time they're not even rare objects, it's pure vanity. It's just pure demonstration of our ability, our supposed ability, the ability that we want other people to see and accept as reality, the ability that we want people to see in us, as if we are more able to affect the world than we actually are, right? I mean, it applies to all sorts of objects. I mean, just a pearl. I mean, the fact that anybody, check out Tiffany's sometime, and so you price a string of pearls. I mean, you can get a string of pearls for about $20,000, right? And I mean, do you know what a pearl is? I mean, it's essentially clam snot, right? So a clam has this thing called a nacre. It's the smooth inner layer that separates the rough outer shell from the fleshy part of the actual clam animal, right? And every now and then some grains of sand will get caught between the nacre and the fleshy part of the clam, and the nacre will defensively respond by enveloping these grains of sand into a ball that is gradually moved closer and closer to the periphery of the clamshell until it's expelled in the form of what we've come to identify as pearl. All right, this is clam snot. It's the clam expelling a foreign object in the same way that mucus does in your nasal cavity. The only difference is it's not this liquidy, viscous shit that comes out of your nose. It's something hard and brittle that you can put on a string, and that some asshole in a store in Manhattan can charge $20,000 for. And if you are one of these people that would. I'm not even talking about if you have the money, because most of us, anybody watching this video, probably doesn't have the money for a string of pearls. But if you're one of these people, and there are a great many people out there like this, that really would spend $20,000 on a string of clam mucus, essentially, in a world where people are freezing to death on sidewalks and starving to death in third world countries to produce your fucking sneakers and your clothes and your computers and your iPhones and your sugar and your chocolate and your whatever the hell else and your diamonds. But guess what? You don't get to be a good person. You don't get to call yourself that. You shouldn't anyway. If there's any homogeny between these two types of acting, between economic acting and personal acting. Right, and so, the reason I draw a distinction between pearls and diamonds is, I'd actually be pretty thankful if the worst implication of buying a diamond was that you're spending tons and tons of money on something stupid and useless when you could be using it to alleviate the suffering of countless human beings around the world or even in your local area, right? If that were the worst of it, we'd be doing just fine, okay? But that's not the worst. That's actually the best thing about buying a diamond, is that you're wasting money that you could be used to feed and clothe hungry, cold, horribly suffering people, right? And I know what a lot of you are saying right now. But Pete, not all diamonds are conflict diamonds. Not all diamonds are evil. My diamond is Kimberley process approved. Okay, so for those of you who don't know what the Kimberley process is, it's a United Nations created certification scheme that tries to distinguish between diamonds that the United Nations identifies as produced morally and other diamonds that are produced immorally, or what it identifies as moral. Okay, I'm going to go in, I promise you, into why the Kimberley process is complete and utter bullshit, and why it doesn't do a goddamn thing for anybody other than the diamond industry and people who want to buy diamonds and feel good about themselves. Okay, but let's pretend for a second it wasn't complete and utter bullshit. Or let's pretend it actually did do something positive in terms of separating, quote unquote, good diamonds from bad diamonds, right? Conflict diamonds from non-conflict diamonds. The Kimberley process is not a set of laws, right? It's not a regulatory system. It's a certification system. It puts a stamp on a certain product, thereby identifying it as quote unquote moral, as ethically produced, as ethically responsible. And then it gives the consumer the choice to either buy this or buy some other diamond. In other words, you don't have to buy a Kimberley process approved diamond. You don't have to. You can buy any diamond you want, right? And if you buy a non-Kimberley process approved diamond, I mean most dealers tend to have Kimberley process approved diamonds. They do, because they'd just be stupid otherwise. Why not? But the thing is, you don't have to. You can buy any diamond you want. There's no law that says you can't own a diamond that hasn't gone through KP certification. There's no law that says you're going to go to jail or that this is going to be confiscated from you if it doesn't go through KP certification. So essentially, remember the Hershey metaphor. Not the metaphor, the Hershey story, Hershey example that I used in the last video, where it's a high probability that a lot of the raw cocoa a corporation like Hershey uses comes from, at least partially, from slave labor in West Africa. Not just slave labor, but child slavery, right? But even if Hershey were to come out and openly admit, yes, we use child slavery because that's just what we like to do, nothing would happen, because we are not a society. And when I talk about us as a society, I mean the global society that we all belong to, that we're all connected in a very real, material, concrete sort of way. Because our society is not governed by laws, it's governed by markets. first and foremost, and this is the heart of neoliberalism, and there's very few resources that are more neoliberal than diamonds, right? So you have the option, you have the freedom to choose whether or not you want to buy the products of slavery, to buy the products of conflict, to buy the products of starvation, to buy the products of economic and environmental devastation. That's considered your freedom. It would be considered a un-American, undemocratic, socialist, totalitarian plot to take away your freedom. If anyone ever suggested that maybe you shouldn't have the freedom to do this, I mean, we take away people's freedom all the time in terms of choosing to do other things. I mean, think about drugs. I mean, think about the billions of dollars that are spent on making sure something as benign as marijuana stays out of people's hands in our own country. But when it comes to something that is fundamentally derivative of slavery and violent militia groups attempting to overthrow their governments and all this type of stuff, I mean, ultimately you have the choice whether or not you want to participate in that. That's fine, because that's free markets, and how dare you even think of interfering with the free market, right? And I mean, these are all conditions that would, I mean, if they existed in our own country, they would be immediately shut down. They would be immediately, dismantled through violent force, through deadly force, if necessary. But you go, I mean, just a couple thousand miles away, you take it to another continent. You take it to another explicit political structure that we've rationalized as having as ourselves having no obligation toward. And all of a sudden, the people that are folded under these processes are not our responsibility. It's not. There's no moral implications on our part if we participate in consuming the products of these processes. And really, I mean, what that implies is pretty obvious. I mean, it implies that there's a difference in importance between people that are born here and people that are born, in Africa and Haiti and South America. I mean, and many of you watching this video may agree with this idea that human life is just somehow intrinsically worth more if it falls out of the right vagina that just happens to be located within a set of imaginary lines that we call the United States, or that we call Europe, or that we call Canada, or any other white Western country, right? As opposed to falling out of the wrong vagina in Botswana or Namibia or the Congo or Rwanda or Burundi or Uganda or blah blah blah, the rest of it. Okay? But the implication is pretty obvious, right? The implication is absolutely, positively there. So let me just talk about this thing called the Kimberley process for just a minute. All right. The Kimberley process, again, is this certification system that's supposed to certify certain diamonds as being conflict-free, as according to the United Nations, right? And let me just make something really clear before I go any further. The Kimberley process does not exist, and it never has existed to make sure that diamonds are conflict free. It never existed to infuse any form of morality into the diamond industry. What the Kimberley process was designed to do was to shut everybody up that got upset in 1998 about an article published by a very admirable organization of human rights activists called Global Witness, that published in 1998, they published an article called A Rough Trade, which was about diamonds being sold in the United States and Europe, funding the actions of a violent militia group in Sierra Leone that was cutting off people's arms to keep them from voting. And this is actually the article that first coined the phrase blood diamond. it was through this article in 1998 that word, that phrase, first started popularly entering the Western vernacular, right? And this upset sort of poked and prodded at the United Nations, at the Security Council, until the pressure manifested in a resolution to develop some sort of certification scheme. And this was in 2000. It wasn't until 2000 that they actually decided, okay, maybe we should fucking do something about this. And it took them 3 years, right? So in 2003, they finally came out with the Kimberley process. And what this is, it's a system of checks and balances and regulations where diamonds have to be shipped in sealed containers, and they can only be bought from approved, Kimberley process approved buying offices that are in non-conflict zones, and blah 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 blah, right? And what it supposedly does, according to the UN, is it certifies that this is not a conflict diamond. That's really the only thing it addresses. The first issue with this is it doesn't address anything about working conditions. So you could run some mine in South Africa, for instance, that might collapse on 100 people any day of the week, and that's fine. That's Kimberley process approved. Hey, good to go, right? It doesn't address anything about pay. So you could be a garimpiro in Brazil doing river diving 15 hours a day, using a bunch of ghetto-rigged equipment, breathing off of garden hoses, 30 or 40 feet underwater, and where you make maybe about $5 a week or something, because you get a share of whatever diamond you happen to find. And if you don't find anything, you don't get paid anything at all. You just get like a bowl of rice from your employer every day. That could be going on. You could be one of these people. And Kimberley process approved. Good to go. All right. So it doesn't address anything about the structurally violent properties of the diamond industry. But the other thing it doesn't address is it doesn't address the actions of legitimate governments. So what it defines as a conflict diamond is a diamond that is funding any illegitimate militia group that is taking violent action with the goal of overthrowing a legitimate government. Okay, any diamond that funds that sort of thing is considered a conflict diamond. Okay, and what this completely ignores is violent, horrifying actions committed by legitimate governments. So, for instance, I think this is actually a pretty poignant example. So, in the Central African Republic, for instance, in the 70s, there was this guy named Jean Bokassa, right? And I mean, this guy, he's a pretty typical, pretty textbook post-colonial Idi Amin-like, Central African scumbag. Okay, I mean, there's nothing particularly significant or special about this guy in that regard. But yeah, so I mean, he successfully managed to overthrow the government, and he became the legitimate government, and his reign of terror ensued. He did all kinds of fucked up shit to Central African Republic before he was finally removed. But I mean, some of these things include, taxing everybody into starvation, wearing a crown with this big giant diamond in it that I think was worth about $20 million or something like that. He cut down miles and miles of fruit-bearing vegetation that people depended upon for food to make way for his presidential processions. And there was one incident where he actually had 100 children executed publicly in the streets for throwing rocks at his limousine. Right. So now, this sort of thing becomes pretty relevant, because I mean, if you were to apply this to the current standards of what the Kimberley process actually addresses, the question of whether or not somebody like Jean Bokassa, if he were still in power, the question of whether or not you'd be able to to buy diamonds from him in a KP certified way becomes pretty relevant. And I mean, the answer ultimately is yes, because he's the legitimate government. Because think of this in terms of what was happening in the 70s if the KP process had existed. Think about this in terms of whether or not this is happening, of this happening right now, right? So while he was on the illegitimate side of things, if his movement to overthrow the government had been funded by diamonds, that wouldn't have been okay by KP standards. That would have been bad. You couldn't do that. That would have been a conflict diamond. As soon as he became the legitimate government, as soon as this happened, as soon as the war was over, there was no more war going on in this country, but he was still instituting this reign of terror, still treating these people like garbage, okay, still summarily executing people and arbitrarily detaining and torturing detractors and all this sort of thing. None of this would matter. None of this would go into anything that has to do with whether or not a diamond is KP certified or not, because it's not a conflict diamond anymore, because there's no conflict anymore, right? So, I mean, the point is, you can be a genocidal, monstrous asshole that runs his country like his own private toy box, right? You just can't be a rebel, right? You just can't be someone trying to overthrow a legitimate government. As long as that isn't the case, if you want to fund yourself with diamonds, then go right ahead. We'll slap a KP certification on that sealed box coming from the approved KP buying office in your country, and we're good to go, right? And I mean, the third problem with this sort of process, and I mean, this is pretty significant, is the problem of smuggling, right? So Central African Republic, for instance, right now is okay for buying diamonds. It's not a war zone, but it's right across the border from the Congo, which has been in a perpetual state of war for at least the past decade, arguably longer than that, off and on, in sporadic bursts. But the Congo is not, Democratic Republic of Congo is not okay to buy diamonds from as far as KP certification goes. But the buying offices right across the border are. And there's been a lot of research done on this in terms of discrepancies between the amount of diamonds sold in a country and the amount of diamonds actually produced. And usually the amount sold far outweighs the amount of diamonds produced, which means they're coming from another country. There's a surplus that are coming from another country, and they're most likely coming from these conflict zones that exist right across the border from these approved buying offices. And so you think you're not getting a conflict diamond because it has KP certification on it. Not that it matters, because obviously, as I've already said, the UN definition of what a conflict diamond is pretty narrow and useless. But even then, half the time it's bullshit, because you have absolutely no idea whether or not this was a smuggled diamond that came from a legitimate war zone, and that absolutely was used to fund some disgusting genocidal, ethnic cleansing militia group like the one in the 90s in Sierra Leone that were cutting off people's arms to keep them from voting. Yeah, so I mean, like I said, I mean, there really has never been a time when diamonds were commercially produced by the West that they weren't produced by some form of slave, whether it be just legitimate, absolutely legitimate slaves during direct colonization in Africa for the most part, or some type of wage slave, or some type of indirectly enslaved person that's enslaved by their own indigenous population, but really at the behest of Western corporations, 2,000 miles away. It's really never existed in any other way. And we have this mindset that, the world's changed. No, the world really has not changed. What's changed is our language that we use to describe it, and what's changed is the directness and the obviousness of how we force people and by we I mean the West and the Western economic structure, how it forces people to do what it wants them to do. That's changed. The methodology has changed. The ways of describing it has changed, but the world really has not so much in terms of the ultimate final bottom line result. Okay. I mean, De Beers, De Beers used, I mean, at one time De Beers produced 90% of the world's diamonds until it was it became painfully obvious that diamonds are really not very rare, and mines started being discovered all over the place more rapidly than they could ever hope to buy them up and control them. Now they produce around 60% of the world's diamonds, which is still a respectable chunk, but they control the distribution of 90% of them, and they tend to hoard them through a subsidiary of their corporation called the Central Selling Organization. That what it does is it's meant to what they would call stabilize the market, which really what they do is they hoard all of the rough diamonds that come out of all these various mines that are pressured. These mine owners around the world, whether they be in Russia or South America or Africa or Canada or whatever, are typically pressured into joining this cartel. This is essentially what the Central Selling Organization is. It's a cartel of mine owners and distributors and wholesalers and cutters and blah blah blah. Really every appendage of the diamond industry, and they do this for stabilization purposes, to make sure that the prices really never shift very much. They just stay at this exorbitant level by creating a false scarcity. They hoard the majority of them, and they allow a certain amount, a very calculated amount, out into the open market every year through these events that they call sites, where all the top wholesalers around the world gather in an office building with De Beers executives, and they are given a box full of all of the rough diamonds that they will be allowed to introduce to the global market that year. Right? And I mean, De Beers, they typically take drastic measures to extinguish any outside relationships between individuals and mines that do not want to be part of the Central Selling Organization. But I mean, it's this process that's led low information people in terms of this sort of industry to believe that diamonds are rare. They're not rare at all, right, by any stretch of the imagination. There's an illusion of rareness, and that's what keeps the price up. Okay. I mean, De Beers, I mean, right from its advent, has been, was an appendage of British colonialism in South Africa. I mean, it was right on the ground floor of British colonialism when the British Empire pretty much bought South Africa from the Dutch. The Dutch didn't think it had very many resources. South African terrain is very rocky, and it doesn't look like it really has much to offer, but as it turns out, it has quite a bit to offer. British took advantage of that. They bought it from the Dutch, and De Beers was started by a man named Cecil Rhodes. You ever heard of the Rhodes Scholarship? That's this guy. He's the one who set it up. He was a typical man of his time. I mean, he was a typical ignorant colonial scumbag that very much believed in the superiority of white Western society, right? But I mean, he was also, on top of that, completely insane, right? So I mean, he set up the Rhodes Scholarship, for instance, in hopes that it would produce a line of what he called American philosopher kings that would advocate for the repatriation of America back into the British Empire. That's literally why he set up that scholarship. It's a scholarship to send American scholars to Oxford University, right? So, Cecil Rhodes, okay, he started De Beers by essentially swindling this Dutch farmer named Johannes de Beers out of his land, which he did not know had diamonds underneath it, but Cecil Rhodes did. And so he sold his farm, the De Beers farm, for pittance, and just sort of inadvertently loaned his name to one of the oldest and most successful corporations in Western history, before disappearing into the void or whatever. Cecil Rhodes, he arrived in an atmosphere that was already sort of diamond crazy. The diamonds in South Africa, they were first discovered at the confluence of the Orange and Vaal rivers, and this area started to develop this kind of unruly amalgamated economy that eventually turned into a larger and larger community, and was eventually sort of an urban development that became named New Rush. Okay? This is modern day Kimberley in South Africa that we're talking about. This whole area that used to be called New Rush, right? But around all these diamond mines and plots and things like this, there grew this sort of economy that was very indicative of the element that the diamond plots attracted. So there were lots of casinos and lots of taverns and bars and whorehouses and all sorts of miscellaneous shops and things like this. And there were also meat vendors. Right? And the meat vendors are actually pretty significant, because the way that they got their meat was that they would go out into the South African wilderness, and they would shoot game animals, which coincidentally were the same game animals that the Zulu and the Xhosa and the Bahaka and the Futi and all these other Nguni hunter-gatherer ethnicities needed for subsistence, and they shot them so much, they overhunted them so much, that all of these various ethnicities did not have the meat anymore to feed themselves and feed their families, and so they were essentially forced to get jobs in New Rush in order to get money so that they could buy meat from the meat vendors. And this is how all of these different ethnic groups came to be workers in the mines, and what people called Kafirs, black diggers, back then. So yeah, I mean, at this point, abolition in the British Empire was very much in place. British outlawed slavery in 1812, I believe, was the date. But when black people in these colonized zones in Africa would enter into employment with white property owners, they were required usually to sign employment contracts that were really not so dissimilar from slavery. In fact, if you signed an employment contract and decided you just wanted to quit and leave your job, and you did because maybe you don't like the way you're being treated, which would be perfectly understandable considering the type of treatment that a lot of these diggers received, it was actually a jailable offense to break this contract that you signed. So I mean, once you did this, as a way of trying to adapt to the scarcity created by the colonial administration in the first place, you were pretty much subjected to the same sorts of sort of structure that was indicative of slavery, and there really wasn't much difference between it and that. Okay. And I don't want this to run as long as the last video. I know, I mean, it was over an hour or something like that I talked. But I just want to make the point and lay down just the sheer extent of how much gravity diamonds have had over the past century in the lives of everybody, that of so many people that live in what we now identify as third world countries, particularly in Africa. I mean, what we now call Zimbabwe was once called Rhodesia. It was once a country named after the founder of De Beers, because he was not just seen as and he wasn't just simply a business owner. He was an agent of colonial authority, and someone that engaged in a variety of manipulations with the goal, with the successful goal, which he was very successful at, with the goal of folding more and more territory and more populations of people under the direct ownership of the British Empire. Okay, I mean, he had a relatively healthy relationship with the Queen of England. This was a very powerful guy, and he was absolutely 100% a psychopath. Okay, and the mess, just the post-colonial mess that diamonds are just inseparably a part of now in places like Central Africa is Cecil Rhodes' legacy. It's really not the Rhodes Scholarship. It's that. It's diamonds funding these disgusting, rampaging, genocidal groups that are all vying for the same power vacuum that was left behind by colonial administrations. It's starving people with decimated economies working in alluvial mines for 5 or 10 cents an hour, right? Or 5 or 10 cents a day, right? It's people in South Africa dying in cave-ins because there's zero safety regulations, as prescribed by the IMF and the conditions of structural readjustment. And I mean, it's not okay. It's not okay. You don't get to be a good person while engaging in this. And again, I'm not claiming that I'm a good person, because there's many systems of material production, systems of industry that support our material culture that I engage in, right? Quite willfully, right? But again, the extraneous absurdity of something like a diamond, something like jewelry, just sets it so much further apart than something like sneakers, or something like clothes, or something like a computer that has a utilitarian purpose that you must adhere to, okay, that you must adopt. Right? And, I mean, the real world manifestations of how diamonds kind of feed into this distinction between community moral acting and what we consider economic acting that I talk about in the last video are just so numerous. I'll usually use the example of the diamond shop owner. I mean, if I were to drag the owner of a diamond shop out into the middle of the street and put a bullet in his head, my question is always, how would that be more brutal? How would it be more brutal? Any more brutal, or any more savage, or any more immoral than everything that it took to put those diamonds in that shop? How would it be? And until someone can definitively answer that question for me, I want to know why it is illegal and morally reprehensible to kill that man that owns that diamond shop, that willfully participates in the perpetuation of this sort of system. But it's totally morally acceptable and not illegal at all to do everything that it takes to put the diamonds in the shop in the first place. Why is that our choice? Why is that representative of our freedom? Why should you have the freedom, or I have the freedom, to choose whether or not we want to participate in the perpetuation of slavery and ethnic cleansing and economic devastation and starvation and suffering and poverty and all the rest of it? Why should that be included in what you consider freedom? To take other people's freedom away, or to to actively participate in a system that is built specifically to deprive people of their freedom and their dignity and their ability to function like a normal human being. So, I mean, with the industry, when it comes to the industry, there's a couple no's that you need to proceed with the assumption of, okay? So no. Most individual diamond dealers do not have the ability to verify the diamond's country of origin, mainly because of how diamonds are channeled through the central selling organization, right? And because of the problem of smuggling. You may think it's KP or KP certified because it's coming from an approved buying office. You have no way of absolutely knowing that, okay? And no, the Kimberley process does not ensure that a diamond was not involved in bloody violence. Kimberley process was a method of shutting up humanitarian prods at the industry and easing the concerns of socially conscious consumers. So it's an instrument of moral masturbation for people that just want what they want because that's what they want, and they want to feel good about it too. They want to also be a good person. You don't get to have both things. I'm sorry. Right. And, you know, I mean, there are so many things in our material culture that we identify as just these objects without any history. It's just this thing that exists in a shop. It didn't come from anywhere. It wasn't produced by anyone. Somebody just pulled it out of their ass and sold it to you, as far as your thought process is concerned, because you have other things to think about, like, you know, your kids and your lawn and your favorite episode of NCIS or whatever the fuck it is you think about. All right. Every object in our society has a deep and complex and surprisingly significant history, right? Every single object that you can possibly, you know, imagine, and that you probably use every day of your life. And usually these objects are part and parcel to this governance of private organizations that feed off the suffering and the economic deprivation of populations all over the world, in order to keep you running on this treadmill of consumption and essentially turn you into a little human battery that just powers the bank accounts of these organizations and keeps them in power and maintains their influence over the structure of your economy and the movements of your government, right? And, you know, I mean, there's probably more morality, I would say, in selling crack than there is in selling diamonds. But we don't look at it this way. Right? Because again, there's this distinction between what you do economically and what you do privately. So you can be this nice guy diamond wholesaler, and you can be this nice guy, you know, whatever, that just wants to give their fiance a diamond ring, and it requires no explanation. It should require an explanation. And if you're so convinced of your you know, ethical cleanliness, you're so convinced of this, then you should have no problem justifying it. You should have no problem reasoning it out in relationship to the history. But, you know, most people, they won't even attempt to do that. And, you know, I mean, make no mistake, I am not convinced of my ethical cleanliness. I don't include myself in that sort of with that sort of title, because I think that title is just sort of indicative of a fantasy. It's a fantasy to think that we even can legitimately have that title while occupying a place in the society in which we live. Right. So anyway, I mean, a lot of the history that I'm talking about, there's a lot of really good books about it. The Last Empire by Stefan Kampfer is a really good one. It goes into a really deep history of South Africa, and the De Beers Corporation. Another really good one, which talks more about how the modern diamond industry functions, is the Heartless Stone by Tom Zellner. I encourage anybody watching this video to take a look at one of these books, and there's many more that can articulate this sort of thing with a lot more depth and authority than I have over the past 55 minutes. I just I don't know. I had a long day, and I just felt like talking, and felt like talking about diamonds because they've really been pissing me off for a long time. And I've always every time I hear one of these really disgusting examples of how the diamond industry has worked itself out in the real world, with from I mean, Namibia nationalizing their mines and forcing all these indigenous people off their land and putting them in essentially these concentration camps, where they're fed rations, and they're all malnutritioned and dying of communicable disease now, to make room for De Beers to come in and build mining infrastructure where these people used to live, to Pat Robertson owning diamond mines in Liberia, right, which has just been filthy, with militia groups fighting each other and funding themselves through the sale of diamonds, and using a significant amount of donation money to Pat Robertson's organization, Operation Blessing, to haul mining equipment to his mines. Money that was produced from the good intentions of old Christian ladies that watch televangelists like him and think it's some sort of religious obligation to give him money, even though they can barely afford it. It's just there's so many terrible manifestations of how this works out in the real world, and more people should talk about it. I think the rules of our discourse with speaking and addressing, speaking about and addressing diamonds should change. It's not an admirable thing to buy a woman a diamond. It's not an admirable thing to receive a diamond. No, I don't think your diamond is pretty. No, I'm not happy for you. Yes, I think you're a piece of shit for willfully ignoring any of the information that is readily available for you about the moral implications of this goddamn thing you insist on having. So anyway, I'm approaching 1 hour, so I'm going to cut this short, right? As short as this can be at 58 minutes, but yeah, feel free to comment if what I've said pissed you off, if what I've said made you happy, whatever. Feel free to comment. All right. See y'all later.